Good afternoon, Dan Mattock. How are you?
Hey, good afternoon, Kurt. I am doing awesome. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah, it's wonderful to talk to you, Dan, today. Today, I'd love to uh, talk to all our YouTube fans about electronic OEMs or original equipment manufacturers and how they are investing in the circular economy. So thanks for joining me today, Dan.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Kurt. This is great. I'm excited here.
Awesome. So for those of you who may not know Dan Mattock, Dan Mattock is a vice president with Securis. He's actually been with the company for more than 15 years. He holds a number of certifications. One is a CSDS, which stands for Certified Secure Data Destruction Specialist. Dan also holds a certification and LEED, which is the leadership and energy and environmental design certification. Many people know Dan from his role as the president of the Northern Virginia chapter of the National Property Managers Association, which is pretty cool. But today, really, I'm interested in talking to Dan because of his experience consulting with some of Securis' largest customers on the topic of data security, the circular economy, as well as IT asset disposition best practices. So Dan, I'm super excited to learn from you today.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks, Kurt.
All right, Dan. So not everybody listening to this podcast is going to understand the term circular economy. So can you help just, and maybe in layman's terms, give me an idea of what that means, and especially as it, with respect to electronics manufacturers?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, yeah, the term circular economy came on the scene. I'd say I've heard it used more and more often from maybe about 5 to 10 years ago is when it really started. But the gist of it is that it's basically an economic system. It refers to an economic system designed to minimize waste, make the most efficient use of resources by really keeping products, materials, resources as long as possible. And maybe that's through the design of the product initially, or it's during its full life cycle, towards the end of the life cycle, trying to find ways to reuse the product, even repairing or refurbishing. And then even towards the end, recycling the product in a way where all those raw materials can go back into new products. And so, yeah, in regards to electronics, what's interesting, one example where we see of this is, so the EPA, they've published some calculators that just show how much better it is for the environment. And first of all, if you can recycle the electronics, but even more dramatically is if you can reuse the products and extend their life. It's actually dramatically better for the environment in terms of not having to tap into some of the virgin materials that are so costly to mine and so forth.
Yeah, that's an incredibly big deal. Thanks for helping us understand the circular economy. And, electronics obviously is your expertise, but I saw a segment on PBS News where clothes were ending up on a beach in Africa. Super disappointing. But we've all also heard the stories of either electronics or electronics components going overseas where they were supposed to be recycled and ended up in landfills. So I think I really applaud the efforts of many of the vendors that we work with. People like HP and Dell all have initiatives around circular economy. And then, of course, we'll talk later about contract manufacturers, many of the people that manufacture everything from iPhones to servers. But sometimes people buy things, and for whatever reason, whether there's an issue with it or maybe it was the wrong item, sometimes we have to return those items. So I've recently learned more about a term called reverse logistics. Can you help me understand that a little bit more, Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. So Yeah, reverse logistics really refers to the process of managing the flow of products and materials that go from the customer back to the seller or manufacturer. We're used to the logistics, right, of products going from the manufacturer to the consumer, but just play that in rewind, and that's really what reverse logistics is all about. So it's what, some of the activities that would be involved in reverse logistics would be transportation, it's returns of products, repairs and refurbishment could be included. It's same with recycling and disposition. And so what's interesting is that I think most people aren't aware of how enormous this industry is. If you look globally, I think the reverse logistics industry for all products is approaching close to $1 trillion.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, it's enormous. And in the US is maybe it's closer to about 20% of that. I've seen maybe a little less. I've seen statistics where it's maybe 150 billion to 180 billion dollars a year. The components that I focus on are on the electronic side. That's a subsection of the total reverse logistics market. That's closer to, anywhere from 20 to 30 billion a year. But you can just see the magnitude of that when these manufacturers are tasked with getting returns and equipment back to them after they've already sold them to customers.
Okay, great. Another term that I think it's important for our listeners to understand is RMA. I think I first learned about this term all the way back when I worked at NetApp in the early 2000s. I know that Securis has a thriving eBay store where we actually remarket equipment on behalf of our customers. So I know that this is occasionally, but not often, based on what I'm looking in terms of our satisfaction rating part of our process. But what does the term RMA mean, Dan?
Sure. And it's funny you mentioned this, Kurt, because I was just meeting with one of our clients a couple days ago, a municipality, and he was talking about the RMA policy of one of his vendors. So what RMA stands for is Return Material Authorization. And the way to think about this, it's basically the process of where a manufacturer or supplier grants the customer the right to return a product for a refund or maybe a replacement or even a repair. You typically see this when there's a defect with the product, whether it's, and a lot of times these are covered by the warranty of the vendor. So it's basically, another way to think of it, it's basically a permission slip for a customer to return their product. So.
All right, perfect. That's helpful. So now I know what reverse logistics is. I understand the circular economy and RMA. Dan, help me understand. We're going to talk about contract manufacturers, but why might one of these OEMs outsource this process of reverse logistics?
Yeah, so we see a lot of this in our industry where OEMs are experts a lot of times at designing their products, whether that's computers or other electronic devices. They're experts at the design. A lot of times they're experts at the supply chain management of it. But where they're not as well versed is just the idiosyncrasies of the reverse logistics game. And on the surface, it may look simple. Oh, you just need to get the equipment back to the manufacturer. But a lot of times there's a lot of operational complexities involved. You're not sure how the equipment, what state it's going to be when it's returned. If you're looking to do repairs, it's really a different business. And so what a lot of these OEMs elect to do is they want to be the best at the design and the supply chain management, but they want to outsource the core competencies of the reverse logistics game because that's just really not who they are. And that's not what they do. And there's going to be others who are more efficient and more cost effective at doing it. So.
Okay. So give me an idea. Who are some of those companies? I know that Securis has worked with a number of them. You worked with some of them personally. Mm-hmm. What are some examples of companies? If I want to start, Hertz Computer, tomorrow, right?
Mhm.
Maybe I would hire you, and we're probably not going to do our own reversal logistics. Who can we talk to if we want to
Mm.
hire somebody to help us out?
Yeah, so probably some of the most prominent names in the reverse logistics space are companies that a lot of us have heard of, right? The FedExes, the UPSs, DHL is a pretty popular one, but those that may not be quite as popular, that you have companies like Flex, they do a lot in this space. There's GXO, that's a reputable reverse logistics company. And then there's Reconnext, which is also one where, again, a lot of them are involved in just helping these OEMs get equipment back, and then sometimes they'll even add more value by doing some of the work when it comes to refurbishing or repurposing some of the equipment and returns as well.
Okay, great. That's super helpful. So here's something that might just surprise some of our listeners. I've come to find out that sometimes inspection, sorting, repackaging, testing, and then trying to resell that equipment that came back in the RMA process, it's actually way more expensive than remanufacturing. So, why is that, Dan? Do you have any guesses based on your expertise in the industry?
Yeah, it's interesting. I like to think of it this way. So if you're talking about remanufacturing, I mean, picture a warehouse where you have equipment being assembled, and it's usually it's very easy to manage because it's streamlined, it's standardized. Engineers get paid to just make that process so much more efficient. Whether there's all types of techniques, right? There's Six Sigma and all those ways of making that manufacturing really efficient. And so when it comes to remanufacturing, you're able to benefit from some of those streamlined processes and that standardization. But when it comes to inspections and repackaging and really kind of more in the reverse logistics side of it's not as streamlined. It's a lot of times the returns, they may be in extremely different condition than when you first sent them out. And some of them may need a unique type of repair that's different from the others being returned. So you really need that individualized attention. And so that makes for higher costs and more difficulties. And the other thing is, there's an infrastructure component to this as well, because as you're getting all these returns, you have to store these returns somewhere. You need warehouse space, you need workstations to work and operate on the equipment. And so that makes it challenging too. In addition, it gets very hard because a lot of times you'll have these unpredictable volumes. You'll be getting returns, but it's very hard to predict at which rate, and that makes it hard for managers to manage through that process. So that's why a lot of these OEMs, it's in their best interest to outsource some of this work, because it's just easier for them, it's more cost effective, and then in addition, they don't have to train the staff. There's a lot of training that goes in to the companies that are repurposing and sorting and repackaging. So those are costs that they can shed when they outsource it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing we should probably talk about is most of these OEMs actually outsource their manufacturing, and
Mm,
they outsource it to companies that are incredibly good at manufacturing. They're highly automated. There may be a scenario where they manufacture equipment for multiple different product lines, multiple different companies, and they may have a factory that, 2 weeks out of the month is manufacturing one line and then switches to another line. But I think because of that high degree of automation, they're able to manufacture things really cheaply. And then when you compare that to things that come back from RMA and are typically one-offs, there's a lot of human element with the inspection, the testing, kind of one-off manual repairs, and it becomes difficult to match that. And so, what I found is that for lower value items, maybe like computer peripherals, it may make more sense to completely break down and recycle that and then manufacture that as new from a cost perspective versus trying to, repair individual items.
Sure.
Maybe you're talking about something that's super expensive, like a storage array or maybe a high-end server. That might be a little different. But some of these, lower end things, I think it's cheaper to manufacture. So, talk to me, Dan, about this whole outsourcing industry known as contract electronics manufacturers. Can you give me some examples of what you're seeing in the electronics industry of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're dead on, Kurt, in that a lot of companies are starting to outsource their manufacturing. I can think of a couple of examples. The big one is Apple. They design their equipment typically in California, but a lot of it is manufactured over in China. I know that's switching, to India, and I know Trump has, I think reprimanded Apple for that, but yeah, you see this with some of the OEMs and on the networking side and server side as well. They're using companies like, Jabil and Flextronics and interesting, Foxconn, which originally was working with Apple quite a bit on their phones and still are, but they are doing a lot of server manufacturing now for some of the hyperscalers out there. And we're also seeing companies like Nutanix, now they're using Supermicro to manufacture and support some of the branded servers. And so, yeah, I mean, an interesting case study too is just to look at the Taiwan Semiconductor Company. I mean, that's how they started and just really ate the lunch of Intel because all of these designers for the chips just completely outsourced to Taiwan Semiconductor. And now Taiwan Semiconductor is, I think it's over $1 trillion business now. So yeah, a lot of times it makes sense to outsource this because the manufacturers just can benefit from economies of scale and expertise and different process improvements that sometimes it's harder to be able to do the design all the way through the whole product life cycle and stack, as well as if that piece of it is outsourced. So
yeah, no, thank you for that, Dan. So let's maybe change gears a little bit. Obviously, OEMs are trying to, be innovative. They're trying to sell more of their products to consumers. Obviously, AI with everything is super hot, right? So these OEMs are trying to balance their need, for innovation with the circular economy goals. I mean, I'm working with many customers today that are in the process of replacing all of their laptops and desktops because the older ones don't support Windows 11 and some of the new AI stacks are out there. So talk to me, Dan, what's the balancing act between innovation and the circular economy? Because sometimes they can be a little bit at odds with each other, right?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, there is a real tension there, between the product companies, they're incentivized to churn out new products and innovate and, just look at Apple, right? I mean, the wave of revenue that's driven each time a new phone comes out, and that conflicts with some of the sustainability expectations that clients may have because what is going to happen to those old phones? Are they going to end up, a lot of times there may be, whether it's phones or in other electronics, there could be hazardous materials in them. So what is that going to do for the environment? So it's interesting, the best companies, I think they're taking that to heart and they realize that the consumer these days, they do care about the environment and sustainability. And so the best companies that I'm seeing, I don't think that they're necessarily forced between choosing innovation or circularity. They're doing what, Jim Collins talks. So he talks about in his books, Built to Last and Good to Great. He talks about the tyranny of the or, And the great companies are taking a view to the and. They want to be both innovative and focus on the sustainability. And so a lot of times when these OEMs, if they are designing the product with the end in mind, I think it was Steve Covey who said, begin with the end in mind. If they're thinking about what will happen at the end of the life cycle, are the materials made from more recyclable materials? Is it easier to recycle at the end? Is it easier to repair at the end? I'm seeing a trend towards that, and I think ultimately that can be a great thing. But you're right, there in the past there's been that natural tension between spitting out new products and the sustainability, but we're starting to see some more awareness on the OEM side with it.
Yeah, I mean, I know HP's got some investment there. I think there are some models with less plastic, with easier to recycle plastic, maybe a little bit more aluminums and metals versus plastic. So I'm definitely seeing something there. So when we were talking about iPhones, Dan, I mean, I personally was part of a class action lawsuit where this goes back a few years, where Apple was accused of purposely making iPhones obsolete in a very short lifespan. So I think that's gotten consumers interested. You know, you talked about the environmental impact, but there's also potentially a cybersecurity impact of these upgrades and end of life equipment. You know, on our website, Securis.com, we do have a article that talks, answers the question whether or not doing a factory reset on your phone protects your data. But what types of products then do require data sanitization before recycling?
Sure. Yeah. So, yeah, I would say in terms of what products require data sanitization, I really lump that into two categories. There's your traditional IT assets that we're all familiar with, right? There's your desktop computers and your laptop computers and your phones and your servers and those types of devices. And what's interesting about that segment is that, that has evolved in terms of the difficulty with which the resources and difficulty in terms of data destruction and sanitization. I think it was basically, back in the mainframe era where, you had these huge rooms and that was basically the mainframe. And while maybe physically it was a lot harder to destroy it because it's so big, you knew where it was, you knew how to secure it. But now with, the form factor getting so small where terabytes of data can be on basically a chip the size of your thumb, you can just imagine for IT directors and CIOs and security officers, just that challenge of now managing all that data that could be all over the place. And so, that's again, one segment is the traditional IT assets. That's, again, becoming harder to manage given, the different form factors. But then the second set of items that really require data sanitization is really exploded ever since the Internet of Things took off. And so there's a lot more consumer devices that you see that require disposition securely. A couple that come to mind would be, the health monitoring wearables or smart home devices. Even think of automobiles now. 40 years ago, I don't know if there were any I don't think there were any computers in cars. Now, I mean, it's basically a car is a rolling computer. So you're seeing that even with, consumer appliances, even some children's toys. There's data being collected about usage and streaming back to the internet. And so those are some of the things now, the smart watches and smart rings even can contain financial data. All those types of devices are in that second segment that, consumers really need to pay attention to in terms of proper sanitization. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think I saw a product announcement recently, and that might not be wrong, exactly right, but I think it was Pure Storage has over a 41 terabyte individual drive now.
Wow.
Which is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
You also brought up wearables. That's not something that I considered a security concern until recently. I know at Securis, one of the pieces of software that we used to make sure that all data is removed from things like computers and servers and phones is a company called Blanco, which is software that we have found to be really great and do a good job. It helps us with our workflows and gets all the data off. But there's a gentleman that left Blanco recently, and maybe I'll provide a link to this in the show notes or the transcript. But he actually now has a company that removes data from smartwatches. So we haven't gotten a ton of them yet at Securis, but I expect that we will. And if we get a scenario where customers are asking us to get them value or remarket those or reuse those, I think that's something that's going to eventually come up for us.
Yeah, no, that's interesting you bring that up. And probably the most dramatic case I recall of the importance of securing the data on the smartwatches. This happened a couple years ago. There were Marines who were stationed at basically an undisclosed military base overseas in Syria. And they would do their morning jogs and they'd run around the perimeter of the base and things. And that data was getting streamed onto an app, and then it was just being published on the internet. And so it just tells you you've really got to think through these devices, not only the data that's stored on them, but the risk it can put various organizations if they're not controlling it carefully.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to switch gears again one more time. And so we talked about data sanitization and why that's important for both consumers and companies and even the US military. But some products really don't contain data-bearing devices, and so they're not going to require sanitation. But I've learned that the OEMs might want those destroyed. Even I think Securis has experience with a brand that manufactures speakers and headsets that I really like to use. Why would a company like that say, hey, I want these devices destroyed?
Yeah, so again, if you take away the data piece of it, I can think of a couple other reasons that manufacturers and OEMs would still want their products destroyed. So the first reason is brand protection. So if an OEM has a product that's either defective or outdated, they want to make sure that those quality standards are kept extremely high. So they're going to want to make sure that that product doesn't get re-released out onto the market. So I can see them really as a way of brand protection. We see that often where OEMs need destruction provided. The other idea is limited liability. So if a product is defective or if it's recalled, and maybe it has, there's potential for it to be do harm, it's important that that gets taken off the market and destroyed. I can think of a lot of times you may see a battery that has either, we call them bulging batteries. If there's, hazardous materials, the OEM doesn't want their name associated with any risk to the consumer if there's been some issue with the product. The other reason that OEMs, would want products destroyed, again, if you take out the data piece of it, is just from a regulatory compliance perspective. Again, if the goods have expired, a lot of times failure to sometimes manage and remove those items properly can result in regulatory penalties. And then lastly, just from if a product becomes obsolete or outdated, a lot of times, the OEM wants to make sure that they're managing demand for their most recent product. And so if you have some of these older generation products, if they can remove those from the marketplace, that's going to ideally drive more demand for their latest generation products. And so those are just some of the reasons that we see OEMs who want to make sure that their legacy products are destroyed properly in an environmental way as well.
Awesome, great. So we're going to continue in the trend. We've talked about OEMs and what they outsource and specialization of different vendors. And so we talked about OEMs outsourcing manufacturing. We talked about them outsourcing reverse logistics. So either those reverse logistics companies or their OEMs, many times they outsource, this recycling or end of life destruction process to somebody called an IT asset disposition company. People like Securis, we do that for a number of OEMs. What kind of services are they looking for, and why would they outsource versus just trying to do that themselves?
Yeah, so a lot of times you'll see OEMs or reverse logistics companies, even they'll outsource the very end piece of the product life cycle to a company like an IT asset disposition company, a company like Securis, because there's a couple components to it. First is just from the data security perspective. We talked about that. There's, depending on the type of device or the way the media is stored, you really do have to be an expert in it to make sure that the data is destroyed properly. And so, what's interesting, especially like I'm thinking some of these laptops these days, and these small solid state drives that are included in them. It's almost like you have to be a forensic expert to be able to look through all these. There's almost like there's little hidden compartments in the laptops that if you're not just very, very careful and an expert in it, we've seen many cases where a small solid state drive can slip through the cracks. So that's one reason OEMs know that they're not necessarily the experts in it. Reverse logistics companies know they're not experts, but there are companies out there that are experts, like the ITAD providers, and so that's a reason that they want to tap into that expertise. That's more on the data security side. On the environmental side too, a lot of the best ITAD companies have to have certain environmental certifications. The most prominent is one called R2, and it's R2v3 is where it's the third version out right now, and they are doing that. The organization that runs that is called Siri, and they are auditing ITAD companies to make sure that they're complying with all the different environmental regulations. They're making sure that the equipment is handled properly, that things aren't ending up in landfills. They're also making sure they're auditing all the downstream potential vendors of the ITAD companies too. So it's a big deal, and that gives the OEMs a lot of comfort. And it goes back to brand protection, that the marketplace will see that they're handling things appropriately. And then lastly, just there's a value recovery component to this. So a lot of times the ITAD companies, they're experts at maximizing the value of whether it's if they have permission to resell the equipment as is and refurbish it, or whether it's just the broken down raw materials. They specialize in this, and a lot of times they're driving that value, and then they're giving some of that sometimes back to the companies that they service. And so those are just a couple of the reasons that you'd see these OEMs and reverse logistics companies want to engage in ITAD. Again, it comes down to that expertise, protecting from the data security side, and then also the environmental side and the value recovery of it. So.
Yeah. So Dan, you mostly have answered my next and close to last question. I appreciate you bearing with me through this learning session here. So obviously, you mentioned R2. You mentioned NAAA, which is a security designation. I had previously mentioned, your individual certification, in which you have a certified secure data destruction specialist. But I guess, I've been told that another reason that these reverse logistics companies, other than the ones you've stated so far, are looking to outsource the recycling or the data destruction to an ITAD company is because the OEM that they're contracted with is looking for a legal document known as a certificate of destruction. So that's an example of one type of reporting or auditing, but what other types of reporting or auditing might the OEM require from both the ITAD and, if it's, subcontracting relationship, but with the reverse logistics company, what are they looking for typically?
Yeah, so it's interesting because it's one thing to actually recycle the equipment or destroy the equipment that the OEM or reverse logistics company provides, but it's another to prove that it was destroyed or recycled. And so a lot of these companies do get audited, and so it's important that they have that evidence. So some of the the methods that we've seen, or some of the deliverables, are anything from serial number capture. So a lot of times a company may want to just see basically a list of all the serial numbers, or even an asset tag of all the devices that have been recycled. And that can come in the form of an Excel file or a CSV file, something like that. We've also seen just weight reporting. There are some cases where they want to see the actual weight, because a lot of times they're tracking for their sustainability goals the pounds of equipment that they have recycled. We've also seen cases where they'll want to see photo evidence.
Mhm.
So whether it's we're capturing with a photo the device right before it was destroyed, or a picture of it afterwards. And then this comes also in the forms of inventory reports, and as you mentioned, that certificate of destruction and recycling. And so one thing that we found also really helpful is if a client is getting audited and they need to refer back, say, to a specific individual item, we've developed, and other companies in our industry have developed, portals where they can go online, log into the portal, and basically search for an individual asset by serial number or asset tag, and it saves them a ton of time. I've seen companies, God bless them, where they were recording all these items on an Excel spreadsheet, and it was basically a 50,000 line spreadsheet. And so you can imagine the time it takes, whereas now with portals that we have, you can just type into the search bar and quickly pull up an asset and prove that it's been dispositioned properly.
Yeah, Microsoft Excel, Dan, the most used database in the world. So 1,000 items starts to be a lot. Last question. Thank you so much. So there may be some OEMs or reverse logistics companies listening to this and wanting to reach out to Securis, but curious about our experience and our past performance. Can you share a couple that might be relevant without providing any information that would be subject to non-disclosure?
Yeah, absolutely. So outside traditional electronics companies that we work with companies that produce audio peripherals, so speakers and headsets and those types of products. We also work with companies that produce alarms. So they're producing the alarm systems at buildings and homes, and they need those eventually to be dispositioned and destroyed and recycled properly. And then also, here's a neat one: drone manufacturers. So they're producing drones, and once they've reached their end of life, those need to be destroyed properly. So those are just some of the OEMs, types of OEMs we work with, among others as well.
Yeah, I mean, I know Securis does a lot of work with the US DoD, Defense Industrial Base, and I think the term, Dan, is called demilitarization at the end of life. What I've learned is, in some cases, these items, they might be concerned that there's classified data on them. In other cases, they're more concerned about enemies of the United States trying to copy, whether it's a radar system or a weapon system or the drone technology. So many of those companies have reached out to us for kind of a use case we haven't talked about yet, but really just that demilitarization use case. But yeah, Dan, I really appreciate you joining. Tons of insights about electronics OEMs and how they're investing in the circular economy. Dan, thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
All right. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.